Russia now looking for economic and military aid from China as reports continue that Russia could now use chemical or biological weapons as Russia's military strikes closer to Poland's border. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, a senior fellow and military expert for defense priorities, joining us now. Colonel Davis, good morning to you.
Morning. Thanks for having me back.
Of course. Russian forces struck a training facility that was about 15 miles away from Poland's border, a member of NATO, as we know. So let's talk about what we can expect if one of these strikes encroaches a NATO country. Would we immediately start sending troops?
Probably not immediately. Well, not immediately. We know that for sure. It's not an automatic trigger. Article 5, despite what some people think, is not an automatic trigger that there's going to be war or that you're going to send troops. It's an automatic, it's a notification that now everybody will consider a strike on one as a strike on all, but each nation still has to go to its own national parliament or Congress to get authorization to act. But it is very, very serious. And one of the big reasons why I have been outspoken from the beginning that we have to be very, very careful how hard we push and how much we respond, because we dare not allow this to extend beyond the borders of Ukraine to potentially hit one of those Article 5, and we end up in a war that would turn a tragedy into a catastrophe.
Well, I spoke with a Ukrainian parliament member who's in Kyiv, and just as you've heard many Ukrainians say, he reiterated they're going to stay and fight to the end. We know this invasion is taking longer than Russia anticipated, and now to hear reports they need help from China, although China's denying that. Does Ukraine have the capacity to sustain for months to come?
You know, that's an odd thing I keep hearing almost repeated across the spectrum in Western media, that Putin is angry because he thought the war was going to be shorter. But, you know, I don't know why anyone would think that Putin expected a war against a country the size of Texas with 44 million people that had been fighting for 8 years would be over in a few days. I mean, we're not even 3 weeks into this, and wars just typically don't last that long. So I think that this is something that Putin may have wanted to have an easy victory, but he certainly didn't expect it. And we know by what he's doing now that he is prepared for a long slog, and they are fighting, you know, viciously day by day in all four of these different fronts, or axes as they're called here. And I unfortunately see that that's going to continue on here. And the concern that I have about, you know, putting all these weapons and helping the Ukrainians to continue fighting, in this declaration that we're going to fight to the end, the problem is that militarily balanced, you take the emotion out of it, the armed forces of Russia and the armed forces of the Ukraine remain very much in balance despite the losses that Russia has suffered in their initial failures. They've learned from those, and they're moving forward now. And if the Ukrainians continue to fight, they're probably not going to succeed, and more of them are going to die. So I'm a big fan of these talks that are going on, and the reports just last night that there may be more progress than we know publicly. And I certainly hope that's the case, because I want to see the killing stop.
All right. Colonel Davis, there's been a lot of talk of the possibility of Russia using chemical weapons in Ukraine. I want you to take a listen to what National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had to say.
It is a very legitimate concern, fear that Russia would use chemical weapons in Ukraine. They're right now accusing the United States and the Ukrainians of potentially using chemical or biological weapons, which is a tell. It's a tell that they themselves may be preparing to do so, and then trying to pin the blame on someone else. That's a classic page out of the Russian playbook. As the president said on Friday, if Russia were to use chemical weapons in Ukraine, they would pay a severe price.
I know at one point your biggest concern about this invasion was Putin possibly using chemical or biological warfare, and really how the U.S. and how we would be forced to respond. What's your response to what Advisor Sullivan had to say?
That remains one of my big concerns, because anytime that chemical weapons are used, and the world rightly revolts is against that, and that raises the emotional and the anger that people have, and they want to do something in response. And look, you just can't discount it. You can't say, oh, Russia wouldn't do that, because they might. I mean, they've already done a number of things we didn't think they would do. And then that puts us in even a greater quandary, because what do you do in response and retaliation? If we enter the war, if we use military means and physical punitive measures, then we become a member of the war. And now that the tragedy of Ukraine can expand beyond the borders, and that would be tragic for the West and for all these countries currently not at war. So we don't want to spread it to them, but you have to do something. And so the trick is going to be to find non-kinetic ways to, put pressure around the edges because there has to be some kind of response. But the conundrum is that if you push even harder on top of what's already been done, then Putin could feel desperate and may even take greater measures. And that's just part of the whole. Once war has gotten out of the bottle, it's just hard to contain it.
Yeah, and taking a look at where we are now, what should we expect to see in the coming days? What next steps are you looking for President Biden and other NATO members to take?
Well, first of all, on the Russian side, what I expect is they're going to continue their methodical progress in the south, the east, and the northeast, because they continue to make progress there. What it appears to me continues to look like they are setting the conditions to cut off the Ukrainian armed forces in the whole east of the country, and then later turn all their forces towards Kiev. Right now, you see they're almost surrounded. The Russians have almost surrounded Kiev on three sides. If they finish any of these other axes and move up, they can literally close the gap around Kiev, and it will be completely surrounded. And then it's either some sort of negotiated settlement, or it's a long siege that could kill thousands.
All right. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.